Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Esther Lam, who is a visiting fellow in East Asian Studies at the MacMillan Center. She heads the Northeast Asia team within the Asia-Pacific section of the United Nations Human Rights Office. A journalist and researcher before joining the United Nations, Ms. Lam has published extensively on human rights, United Nations, and World Trade Organization issues. Among her books are China and the WTO, A Long March Toward the Rule of Law, A Practical Guide to the WTO for Human Rights Advocates as lead author, and SARS and the WHO, An Untold Story. Today we'll talk with Ms. Lam about human rights and multilateral development banks, also known as MDBs. Welcome, Ms. Lam.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Let's start with the term multilateral development banks. What are they?
Yeah. So multilateral development banks, they are international financial institutions, and by definition, they are multilateral, meaning their membership are multiple countries, more than two, as their shareholders. More than two countries as shareholders of this bank. And usually, an multilateral international development bank, they're established by an international agreement. We commonly call them articles of agreement. And they're binding legal instrument for their members, which have ratified the agreement. And so one might think, oh, so hold on, what exactly, how is a multilateral development bank different from a commercial bank? So primarily the difference is that mandate is different. A multilateral development bank, its primary mandate is not about maximizing profits for its shareholders. Rather, it provides loans and sometimes guarantees for loans or other kind of financial arrangement to finance projects in a wide range of areas for development and for raising the standards of living, for ending poverty. And these projects commonly like in areas like energy, transportation, irrigation, and information technology and communication. Yeah.
How many are there?
Well, so it depends on how strictly you fund them. Actually, there are like two handfuls. The most well-known one is the World Bank.
Right.
And actually almost every region, in fact, I think every region has one. You have the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, am I missing it? Oh, the European Investment Bank. And there are two important new additions to these banks in 2016. One is the BRICS Bank. The BRICS is the five countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So it used to be called BRICS Development Bank. Now it's called New Development Bank. And the other one is initiated by China, became operational in 2016. It's called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has a focus on infrastructure development. And there are also sub-regional development banks as well, like in East Africa, in Central America. So quite a number of them.
Are these banks part of the United Nations, or are they part of countries? Who oversees the rules and regulations of the banks?
Yeah, mostly they're not part of the United Nations, but they cooperate very closely with the United Nations. Some of them actually, their establishment itself could be traced back to the regional economic commissions in different regions of the UN. But the good question is who oversees the operations and rules and regulations of the banks. So I mentioned earlier there are the articles of agreement. So all these banks, they have a board of governors who are representatives of the countries that are shareholders. And then, so they oversee the operation of the bank. And then you have a bank president, so you have the secretariat that runs the daily operation of the bank.
And the people who run the bank, would they be more governmental officials or from the private sector, or is it a mix between, CEOs of corporations and government officials?
The people who are doing the daily operations, so the staff, secretariat of these banks, they are professional, they are experts. So in a way, they are civil servants, right? These are multilateral banks. And then for the governors, many of them are representatives of government. They're related to like the treasury or finance department. And so, but each bank has its unique arrangement, but overall, you have the gist of the setting.
Okay, so you somewhat alluded to the role of MDBs, but can you be a little bit more specific as to what they're doing?
Yeah, for example, when we look at, give a sense about the contribution or the size of their finance, no? So when we look at in the past, between year 2000 to 2015, when we had the Millennium Development Goals, so the 15 years. So there's a figure that came out from interagencies task force between the multilateral banks and the UN. So the finance support for development from these banks increased from, I think, 50 billion in 2000 per year to 127 billion per year. So they are providing a lot of supports. So as to what kind of projects, so it's different, right? So sometimes you have like the World Bank and the Asia Development Bank, they also do projects like has to do with healthcare system. They provide also, in addition to fundings, technical assistance and expertise. Some banks help build railway or a dam or hydropower. So it is a very wide range of different projects we're talking about here.
And who determines what projects get funded?
Oh, good question. So clearly, countries and different countries apply they submit proposals for funding, and then each bank will have a mechanism, to review. There would be a standard, I would imagine, a template. The requirement and the project and why, the justification, and then we will be reviewed by, professional staff of each bank, and then the ultimate decision, of course, rests with the board. But oftentimes, I think most of the groundwork and the verification, the screening is done at the professional secretariat level.
Okay, so let's talk about specific examples of how human rights fit into economic development and the MDBs. Can you cite some specific examples?
Yeah, all right. So human rights, how it fit in, okay. Well.
And first of all, I guess we should talk about what do we mean by human rights? I would imagine, one of the missions of the MDBs is to raise people up to improve their quality of life, and that can be in many different regards, from climate change to health care. So can you give some examples of maybe some of the programs that have worked particularly well?
Okay. So there are I can see there are two aspects of your question, right? One is how human rights are relevant or related to economic development, right? The other is then what's the role of MDBs, Multilateral Development Bank, in this? So I actually would try to turn it around and think about this way. We don't just pursue economic development for the sake of, right? It's not the mean in itself. And so when we ask ourselves, what is economic development for? So let's bring it down to our day-to-day level, right? So primarily, it is about, healthcare, food, adequate housing, having access to clean water, sanitation facilities. And these examples I mentioned, they're all internationally recognized and legally guarantee human rights.
Inalienable.
Yeah, they're in different human rights instruments, law, and they're in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is turning 70 years old today. Yeah, well, today, not today, this year. Yeah, so there's an intrinsic link when you think of it. It's not just economic development for the sake of it. And I do believe there's a global consensus now when we talk about development or economic development. We're talking about inclusive, sustainable development, right? So no one should be left behind in today's world. And sadly, many are still left behind. I think I just read a report yesterday, the world's wealth, 50% of it belongs to 1% of the world's population. So many people are left behind, and then I can go on and on about human rights and what we should do about it, because this is what my office does, where I work. But when we come back to the multilateral development bank role, it's interesting because after the 2016 agreement, the consensus on the sustainable development goals, which we call the 2030 agenda. So we're talking about a global consensus where we go from here, 2016, to 2030 when we talk about sustainable development. So there are 17 goals covering a wide range of areas.
With the hopes that those goals are met by 2030.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So the multilateral development banks got together, those examples I mentioned earlier, and they've identified, some areas they can make a contribution. So, for example, let's talk about money, because that's what banks are about, right? That biggest contribution. So there's UN estimate, if we are to achieve these sustainable development goals, we're talking about 5 to 7 trillion US dollars per year. So it's far beyond any foreign official assistance program or any one single country can do. And these banks, their membership are multilateral countries, they're different countries. So that's why it's so important to get together and do this together. And there are some thematic areas that which really jump out to us, the needs. For example, let's think about forced displacement, whether it's because of armed conflict, natural disasters. So these banks, these multilateral development banks, can do a lot to help finance and develop, maintain, and build institutional capacity for these fragile and conflict-affected states. So to help tackle the forced displacement issue. And when we look at the state of the world today, you can see also when large number of people are displaced, then the influx into another country or the host community is also a huge challenge. So these banks can do a lot to help also to strengthen the capacity of the host community to handle all these challenges. So this is one area. I think there was one concrete pledge by the multilateral banks to do this together. They're trying to have a humanitarian development partnership. So to look at these areas of work in the humanitarian summit last year. Another thing that was pretty obvious to all of us is climate change. A lot of projects and programs and work needs to be done to mitigate climate change, requires investment. And this is another area, as far as I'm aware of, the multilateral development banks are trying to work on better and also in a more in sync manner, because you have the Green Fund and you have other funding opportunities out there, but the demands is huge. And then they're trying to align themselves and how to do it, and they're doing it in a way that's most effective and in line with the Paris Agreement.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, lastly, allow me to mention also infrastructure. Investment in infrastructure is vital for a wide range of human rights. The evidence that show when it comes to education, access to a lot of basic needs, and infrastructure plays a huge role. And there's a huge gap also in infrastructure development.
And when you say infrastructure development, do you mean roads so people can get around? I know particularly in Africa that is an issue. Is there anywhere else in the world that infrastructure is a concern?
Yeah, many parts like Asia as well. And so the Sustainable Development Goals, one of it is about building resilient infrastructure. And then transportation, like roads, is one thing. But infrastructure also includes like energy, irrigation, like water system. In fact, information and communication technology infrastructure is also a very, very important part of infrastructure as well. It is so important that there's a new forum among the multilateral development banks and the United Nations relevant agency that was launched last year in April, I believe. It's a global infrastructure forum, exactly to pull together the expertise and see how best to address these needs and to finance these projects in a smart way. And for example, the newly created Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is now financing a number of projects, co-financing with the Asia Development Bank and the World Bank as well. So they're cooperating, the new one, the existing one. So it is an important and challenging time.
Right. What are some of the challenges that MDBs face?
There are plenty, and there are also critics out there about governance issues,
Political issues.
Yeah, but let us focus on maybe the human rights perspective, as we're talking about multilateral development banks and human rights. Put it this way, there are many active civil society actors, NGOs worldwide. They dedicate their efforts to monitor the work and operations of multilateral development banks so that they truly deliver on their promises. And at the same time, that projects they support do no harm to human rights.
Right.
Why so? Because regrettably, evidence shows that human rights can be, and in fact have been, violated sometimes in the context of projects financed by multilateral development banks. And these violations range from forced displacement, forced eviction, child labor, forced labor, and also affecting the local communities, their access to livelihood, and how about the indigenous populations and the people. So there are issues, and I think these banks, they are trying to address them as well, and they have certain safeguards, usually called social and environmental safeguards, to help, kind of a due diligence to help to make sure, okay, these projects won't do any harm to human rights. And then from a human rights perspective, more can be done.
Does the UN play a role in also monitoring?
Well, for our office, we have a few presences, so we do monitoring of human rights situations, but not necessarily only focusing on multilateral development banks. But at the Lam setting level, our office, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has been very active in providing expertise, advice, and submissions to all sorts of multilateral development banks. So when it comes to their different mechanisms, like the safeguard and environmental and social safeguards I mentioned, both the new one by the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and also the one that's revised and also newly revised by the World Bank Group. So that we do. And one of the main suggestions, also by NGOs, is human rights need to be explicitly mentioned in the safeguards and environmental and social safeguards. Because, okay, when the borrower, clearly the responsibility to implement the projects rests with the borrower, the one who borrowed, right, the countries. But as the lender, in this case the multilateral development bank, if they're not vigilant or if they're not very explicit in their loans agreement, grants agreement about human rights, then it won't be taken seriously, right, while you have other challenges in implementing a big projects. So one of the ways to do this is to have very explicit reference to human rights in the safeguards rules, and when vetting the proposal submission for grants and loans, also look into the human rights assessment. There should be a risk assessment, how likely this will affect the livelihood of the local population there. Is there meaningful consultation, like with the local population communities, indigenous people, and also if things go wrong, is there a redress mechanism? How can people be compensated? How to avoid, this from happening? Sure. So a lot of concrete things that can be done, and so clearly the way to go forward is to work together. I don't think. Well, this is my personal view. I think the debate has gone beyond whether multilateral development banks should be vigilant and should be careful whether projects they're supporting can adversely affect human rights. I think that we've gone beyond that. Everyone agrees, clearly.
That should be done, yes.
Exactly,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Because otherwise, why are you doing this, right? You do this.
Exactly, that's the whole purpose.
Yeah. But then the question is how, how
right.
to get there. Yeah, and we still have a long way to go.
Okay. You are at Yale as a visiting scholar, and I know you're doing a little bit of work on the IAAB, the newest MDB. So can you tell us a little bit of what you're doing while you're here at Yale?
Yeah. So I'm here for a semester on sabbatical from my work with the Human Rights Office. I'm normally based in Geneva, Switzerland. And so my research here concerns the AIIB, so Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, initiated by China. And this bank is very significant and interesting in many ways. For example, its membership includes a wide range of countries of different levels of development. Okay. And from all regions of the world. Now, with Canada having applied to join, now North America is included. So, for example, for the G7 industrialized countries, all are there except the United States and Japan. So you have UK, Germany, Italy, Canada, and then you have very developed countries like the Scandinavians are in Sweden and others, and then you have rich countries like Switzerland, Luxembourg, and you have mid-range developing countries, Indonesia, Egypt, Sri Lanka, and then the LDCs, the less developed countries, also from all regions. Ethiopia is in, Afghanistan is in, Nepal is in. So the membership itself is very interesting because when we look at it from a human rights perspective, we were talking about earlier, all these member states, they have human rights obligations. They have ratified international human rights law, and in what they do, they lead to, even if it's done through a multilateral development bank, still they have to be in compliance with their human rights obligations. So there's one. Another thing is the reach of the bank. So it has an Asia focus on infrastructure development, but it has a very wide focus. And many people look at the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank together with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is also a very wide-ranging mega project and initiative. And but at the same time, it has potential to support projects outside strictly Asia. In fact, in September, it has approved a project to support the project in Egypt.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about, if I remember correctly, about water and energy. And so again, it's about how this can play a big role about connectivity. So this is the area I'm looking into, and I must say I've been very, very fortunate. I really enjoyed the excellent interdisciplinary environment here at Yale, and I've had very interesting discussions with other scholars from law school and the MacMillan Center, Council on East Asia Studies, and beyond. And so I'm very happy and thankful for this opportunity, for my employer, the UN, and for my host, the MacMillan Center. So thank you very much.
And we are happy to have you here. Thank you very much for sharing some of your work with us today.
Thank you, Marilyn.
For more information about Ms. Lam, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.